Assassin's Promise by Thomas Woodward. Chapter 58. Azric leaned in his heavily gilded and ornamented chair, raised on a dais above the rest of the audience chamber. This gathering was held monthly within the great hall of his keep that ruled over the city of Kaliapos. Town magistrates, heads of state, and military officers filled the rows of carefully carved wooden chairs that composed the audience chamber. Even a few foreign dignitaries graced Azric with their presence this morning. Lord Azric sat, bored, as another town functionary droned on about the matter of financing the expansion of the aqueducts beyond the outer limits of the city proper, so that those unlucky enough to live beyond its borders might benefit from the progress of a civilized city-state. Peticulus was a thin wisp of a man with a healthy paunch that made him look more like a frog than anything else. He was an annoyance, but necessary after a fashion. Azric needed fools such as this man. They were easily manipulated and could be bought or blackmailed, should the need arise. He held on retainer a spymaster who excelled in providing useful information that could be used to compromise many of the court officials, should he wish to exert his influence over them. More importantly, it allowed Azric to concern himself with other matters. Affecting the look of a dull boredom wasn't hard. It provided useful cover to more closely watch his enemies and gauge their facial reactions. He still had yet to ferret out the identity of the assassin, or more likely, group of assassins. They had been known to work independently, but it was common practice for an employer to hire a second or even third assassin to ensure the job went smoothly, and then kill those hired before him. The other assassins would have no knowledge of each other. However, it had also become common knowledge that this was an accepted practice, and as a result, no man or woman hired as an assassin was overly trusting. Paranoia was the reward for those who lived long enough. It was a common trait among veterans of their trade. One simply implied the other. "Do you not agree, Your Eminence?" a lady in fine gold silks that had been slashed with cream said, waiting for his reply. Azric gave the barest wave of his right hand and sat further back in his high-vaulted, hammered golden chair. Rubies decorated the cushioned armrests and glinted in the light before he returned his arm to the chair. Catching his signal, Lord Palvari rose and saluted before addressing the noblewoman. Azric didn't bother to listen to the response, already thinking on his next move. He would be stuck here for the better part of the day, as the matters of state were never dealt with particularly swiftly. Governing could be painfully rote at times. Azric creaked his jaw in a yawn, not bothering to cover it. He moved his attention back to the group before him. Who stood to gain most from his untimely demise? Yes, who indeed? The courtiers shifted under his gaze as he passed over them in turn. Azric had never had a mind for such things. Cunning was simply not innately born within him. He turned to regard Palvari, a minor lord who supported his house. Palvari's family had been sworn to his for generations. If anything, old blood could be trusted. Surely this was true. If his own house were to fall, it would create a domino effect, and those that had been loyal to him would lose favor in turn. They would either need to scramble to make new alliances or declare brazenly for themselves if they felt strong enough to risk such a move. If favor fell against them, it would end badly for them. Such was the risk of such a ploy. The real problem was that Azric did not usually bother himself with such minor details. That's what he paid his spymasters for. It had been beneath him. His time better served in governing and carving out new schemes to put into action at the high courts. Suddenly, with his own house and his very life at stake, matters had changed somewhat. He smiled ruefully, not wanting to admit the extent of his fear. At such a time, his enemies must not see him change his calm demeanor. It was most important that he did not appear to take any notice at all of the news. If his enemies could not see the loose chink in his armor, they would be more likely to hold back, instead waiting for an opportune moment to strike. If he was foolish enough to display open concern, they would come at him en masse, striking at him boldly with fearless conviction. There were uses for such a stance. He could play to the latter and fool his enemies into committing their hand, but he too would have to be ready for quick retaliation. History did not care for the loser. It only favored those who remained when the dust settled. Lord Pelvari began to sweat under his steady gaze, a sheen coating Pelvari's aged face. Asric had almost forgotten the effect he could have on a man or woman under his power. Dark rumors had managed to surface over the years of the dungeons he kept, and his completely ruthless ability to make use of them. There were times for fear and times for the appearance of generosity. Asric knew he must dole these out in equal measure in order to keep his rule from becoming undermined. If his actions could be counted on, they could eventually be turned against him by a schemer more brilliant than himself. He had been careful to put an arrow through the neck of any such individual who made themselves known to him over the years. The discussion had moved on to simpler matters. He had levied taxes earlier this year, and had planned on doing so again before the month of Moran came to a close. Local town officials always complained when tax season approached. It was nothing new. The minor lords would complain that the peasantry grew ornery and more difficult to control at such times, but it was only a play for additional funding so they could staff their houses with additional soldiers. He ignored such petty complaints. If true revolt broke out, he would hear of it soon enough. Often a simple reminder of the threat of closing the gates of the city in time of war was enough to put the peasants back in line. They were a sorry lot, but he knew the limits to which they could be pushed. He knew better than to try for a third levy this year. His father had made that mistake years ago, and had been so hated by the populace that stinking refuse had been thrown at his carriage whenever he passed. It took putting an entire village or two to the sword before peasants learned who was in charge. Still, they were a sullen lot, and he preferred to save himself the pains of going through such lengths to stay in control. Asric saw a flicker of movement. One of the noblemen brought a fan to her face and began lightly fanning herself. Lady Chastain Eleanor was of high birth and was the petulant daughter of her father, Sir James Eleanor. James held the rank of major in the army of the Western Realm. James was a widower and had not yet remarried. His daughter, Chastain, held the notoriety among her peers that came with her station. She held the eye of many young noblemen, who no doubt wished to gain the impressive lands and titles when her father passed. James, too, held the eye of both the old and young. There were many with a desire to wed and gain power for themselves through the connections his powerful family would provide. Asric saw the sheen of sweat on Lady Eleanor's features. It had been cool this morning, but the inner chamber had a way of heating up with the throng of all those in attendance. Still, he wondered. Bah! He was so bad at reading faces. He simply did not know what motivations drove many of his underlings, all suckling together at the teat of his power. He carefully shifted his gaze, but continued to watch her from the corner of his eye. He could see her whisper to a cluster of noblewomen who sat simpering in attendance to her. A frown caught his eye from the front row. A dark-eyed man of middle years, Sir Rowan Whitestaff, sat with a commanding air. His mouth smoothed itself into a line, but his eyes smoldered in anger at what had been said. Something about this man held Asric's gaze for a moment. When Sir Rowan saw that he was being watched, he bowed his head with a quick and easy grace. The cast of his eyes remained, however. There were too many possibilities spinning in Asric's head. Any one of these nobles could be behind the assassination attempt that would surely come. Or perhaps it was someone of lower birth. Perhaps someone who had been paid to stay silent by someone else in power. Lord Asric steepled his fingers in front of his face, pretending to listen to the most recent topic that had been raised, that of the annual summer festival. He would need to send guards to watch over the city during the 20 days of fire. He would need to give his blessings again to Rorik, god of gold and blood. More importantly, he would need to be seen giving his blessings. It was common for a dozen weddings and duels to pop up in equal measure during the summer festival. Painters, jugglers, and other artisans would litter the streets with their carts. Great stages would be erected to display performers. A talented artisan or playwright could do quite admirably for themselves with luck, or failing that, the right connections. A single word of blessing from Azric could bring fortune to such an individual. Those that were wise sent lavish gifts and promised favors to him in exchange for his patronage and blessing. It was just another form of currency. Every man had his price. Exotic traveling troops were invited from far-off lands to come through the city during the summer festival. Dancers of breathtaking beauty and strange animals in cages would bring crowds spilling into the streets of Kaliapos. The streets were wreathed in red for the duration of the festival. Roses and other red flowers were gathered early for just this purpose, and were spread with great abandon through the streets of the city. Enterprising shops had their signs painted in crimson to show off the season, and duelists wore the traditional scarlet vests that had been the fashion for years. Entire wedding parties were dressed in deep reds and burgundy. Only the bride and groom were the exception to the rule. Their garb was a startling white. It symbolized a blank slate from which to begin their great journey forwards through their remaining years. People had their faces painted. Some wore intricate masks of red, black, copper, or gold. Yet others wore open tattoos, intricately drawn on their faces, lines of markings bringing seductive power to their eyes. Children were set free into the streets and roved like a band of wild dogs, entering shops and following the artisans as they wove slowly through the open thoroughfares. The 20 Days of Fire had an older meaning, however. The Festival of Lights was no longer practiced by the general populace, but had been an older tradition than even the age of the city itself, more than 100 years marking its passing. In those early twilight years, the Festival of Lights was a time for huddling together as a group for protection. Lights were thought to keep evil spirits away from the land. For those 20 days, the fires of the city would burn bright, extinguishing the darkness. Every torch on the ramparts blazed like a beacon. Every home would keep a candle or lamp alight at all hours of the day, and throughout each night unbroken. The city would have appeared as a giant fireball of light and sound, proof that the people still lived, proof that for a stretch of 20 days they would show no fear. For there was darkness beyond the city walls. Ancient texts had hinted at it, but nowadays many had been discarded as simple myths, used to make believe through the long night of winter. All that remained was the name, the Festival of Fire. People strove to outdo each other with greater and greater shows of wealth. Enormous bronze idols of Rorik were situated throughout the city, huge cauldrons filled with gold coins laying in front of them, blood dripping down the god's image throughout the day. Priests of Rorik tended the idols. An armed militant sect of their order ensured no one stole from the immense cauldrons, where gifts to the god lay. Rorik had first appeared in their city less than 200 years ago with the promise of gold and blood. He was an ugly god. His image was rough and brazen, his demeanor callous. The high nobility prayed to his idols for his aid in their dark schemes. Azric gave token faith for power over his populace. Few truly believed these days, it seemed. His priests came from all walks of life, strangely. Their first measure of obedience to his priesthood was to throw off their old life, their old alliances. It was not often a pretty sight. The priesthood bordered on fanaticism, and had grown more powerful over the years. But as long as Azric showed his public support, they followed him to a degree. To openly oppose him would be treason, but there were many layers of loyalty. At best, their token acceptance of his rule gave the rest of the populace their cue.